I want you to understand that I was there when the Vox channels went silent. Not dead silent. There is a difference, you see, between the absence of signal and the presence of nothing, and I had spent 43 years in the astropathic relay station Tertius 9, learning to distinguish between every shade of void that could crawl through the spaces between stars. My designation was Chorus Tender Third Class Methodius Crane, and my purpose was to sort the screaming. That was what we called it. Those of us who worked the graveyard rotation in the bowels of the relay fortress sorting the screaming. The astronomican's light touched everything, you understand. Every psychic transmission in this entire segmentum was threaded through with that golden pulse, and our job was to separate signal from the background howl of the Empyrean, to find the prayers and distress calls and tactical reports in all that cosmic shrieking. I was good at my job. I took pride in it. Even I could identify the source world of a transmission by the particular pitch of suffering in its psychic undertone. Agri worlds had a different desperation than Forge worlds. Death worlds screamed with a resigned frequency that Garden worlds never quite managed, even in their worst moments. The silence came on a Tuesday, though I only know that because I checked the chronometer later, trying to impose some order on what happened. Time meant something different after. Before the silence, my shift had been routine to the point of meditation. I had arrived at Tertius 9 4 decades prior, fresh from the Schola Psychana, on a world I was forbidden to remember, and I had never left. The station itself was an orbital monstrosity, all Gothic spires and armored cathedrals built around a core of ancient technology that predated the current Imperium. We circled a gas giant in a system whose only purpose was to exist between other, more important systems. Perfect anonymity, perfect isolation. The staff numbered 340 souls, 28 sanctioned psychers like myself, 212 tech priests and servitors maintaining the machinery, 97 administratum, adepts processing the endless documentation of our work, and 3 commissars who ensured we all remained appropriately motivated. We never saw ships. We never received visitors. We simply existed in our bubble of processed air and recycled prayer, listening to the Imperium dream its desperate dreams across the stars. My station was in Chamber 17, a cylindrical room maybe 5 meters across, its walls lined with psi-resonant copper that had oxidized to the color of dried blood over the centuries. The receiver apparatus itself was a throne of sorts. They always are, aren't they, these instruments of service? A cradle of metal and cables that interfaced directly with the neural ports they had installed along my spine during my sanctioning. When I jacked in, my consciousness expanded into the local sector of the Empyrean, not deep enough to attract attention from the things that swim in those depths, but far enough to catch the ripples of nearby psychic transmission. The astronomican was always there, a golden thread running through everything, the lighthouse that guided ships through the warp and simultaneously carried every scream, every prayer, every desperate call for help toward Holy Terra, where, presumably, someone listened. I had long since stopped imagining what that someone might be. It was better not to think about the mechanics of the divine. That shift, I processed a distress call from a pilgrim fleet that had been becalmed in the warp for 6 months subjective time. I sorted 3 separate tactical reports from guard regiments on different worlds, each describing variations on the same theme of attrition and entropy. I catalogued 17 personal messages from soldiers to families they would never see again. We were required to log them, though I had no idea if they were ever actually delivered. The administratum moved in mysterious ways, and then, between one breath and the next, the astronomican went out, not dimmed, not flickered, simply ceased, as if someone had closed a door on the Sunday. The first thing I felt was absence. Imagine every sound in your world being generated by a single continuous note, so constant you no longer consciously hear it. And then imagine that note stopping. The psychic landscape didn't go dark. Darkness implies something, a presence of non-light. This was nullification. I gasped, my physical body convulsing in the cradle, cables pulling at the ports in my spine, and for a moment I was certain I had died, that my astropathic link had finally burned out my brain the way it happened to 1 or 2 psychers every year. But I could still feel Chamber 17 around me. I could still hear the mechanical breathing of the air recyclers. I could still smell the incense that burned eternally in the brass sensors mounted on the walls. I was alive. The astronomican was not. I disconnected from the apparatus with shaking hands, my fingers fumbling at the neural cables, and I staggered to the Vox panel on the wall. Station command. This is Chorus. Tender Crane, in Chamber 17. I'm experiencing. I think there's been a malfunction in my receiver apparatus. I'm not reading any background radiation from the astronomican. Please confirm your readings. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too loud in the sudden quiet. The Vox crackled in response, and I heard Magos Brennus's modulated voice, already stripped of any human uncertainty by decades of augmentation. Malfunction is not localized. Chorus tender. All stations report identical cessation of astronomican signal at timestamp 847, M41, 392, 18 hours 34 minutes and 7 seconds. Stand by for further instructions. Stand by. Of course. What else was there to do? I had stood by for 43 years. I sat down on the deck plating of Chamber 17, my back against the copper-lined wall still warm from my psychic exertions, and I tried to understand what the absence meant. The astronomican was the Emperor's light made manifest. It had burned for 10,000 years, an unbroken psychic beacon powered by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers daily, their souls fed into the great machinery of Terra to maintain the lighthouse that made interstellar navigation possible. Without it, warp travel became exponentially more dangerous, not impossible. The navigators had their own gifts, but uncertain, prone to miscalculation and disaster. Without it, the Imperium's communication network lost its carrier signal. Without it, the golden thread that connected every human world to Holy Terra simply stopped existing. But more than the practical implications, more than the logistical nightmare that was surely even now beginning to cascade through every fleet and station and administratum office across the galaxy, the absence meant something else. Something worse. The astronomican was maintained by the Golden Throne, and the Golden Throne was maintained by the Emperor of Mankind, the Corpse God, the Carrion Lord, the Master of Humanity who had sat in immortal undeath for 10 millennia, his vast psychic will sustaining both the throne and the beacon. If the astronomican had stopped, it meant the throne had failed. If the throne had failed, it meant I couldn't finish the thought, wouldn't. There were some ideas too large, too terrible to hold in a human mind, even one trained and sanctioned and rebuilt for the express purpose of touching the immaterial. Instead, I focused on smaller things, the way my hands were trembling, the taste of copper in my mouth, which might have been blood, or might have been the psychic residue of the station's shielding, the sound of my own breathing, too fast, approaching hyperventilation. I forced myself to slow down, counted breaths. This was training they had given us, back in the schola, how to manage panic when your mind was open to the infinite, how to maintain humanity when touching the inhuman. I had never quite believed I would need it for anything other than demonic incursion. It had not occurred to me that divinity might abandon us instead. The Vox crackled again, and this time it was Commissar Helbrecht's voice, level and hard. All personnel to your primary stations. This is not a drill. Repeat. All personnel to primary stations. Stand by for briefing from Station Command in 30 minutes. The channel closed. I remained sitting on the floor, because Chamber 17 was my primary station, and there was nowhere else for me to go. Around me, the relay fortress continued its eternal rotation, the massive structure groaning softly as it turned, a sound I had long since trained myself not to hear. Now, in the psychic silence, every mechanical noise seemed amplified, intrusive. The fortress felt smaller somehow, more fragile. We had always existed in a bubble, but that bubble had been connected to something larger, something infinite. Now we were just a metal shell floating in the void. And the void was very, very large. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. The door to chamber 17 I raised open, and Jeremiah entered. Chorus Tender Second Class Jeremiah Voss, whose station was 3 chambers down from mine, and who had been the closest thing I had to a friend for the last 2 decades. Jeremiah was older than me, his hair gone white, his face carved into permanent lines of concentration from decades of psychic work. His eyes, though, were what I noticed first. They had the look of a man who had seen too far into something he wasn't meant to see. "You felt it too," he said. Not a question. "I felt it, stop," he replied. He nodded slowly and sat down beside me, his movements stiff. The neural ports always made us stiff, our spines threaded with so much metal and wire that we moved like partially disassembled servitors sometimes. I was processing a message from a cardinal on a shrine world in the Segmentum Pacificus when it happened. He was dictating a prayer to be carried on the next astropathic relay to Terra. 20,000 words of theological ecstasy, Methodius. 20,000 words praising the eternal vigilance of the God Emperor. And then the channel just closed. Not at his end, at ours. He laughed, and it was not a healthy sound. "Do you know what that means? Truly? Tell me what you think it means," I said, because I wanted someone else to say it first. I wanted someone else to voice the thought I could not allow myself to complete. Jeremiah leaned his head back against the copper wall, closed his eyes. "I think it means that every ship currently in the warp is lost. Without the astronomican to guide them, they're navigating blind. And blind navigation in the Imperium is, you know what it is. We've processed enough distress calls. They'll emerge decades off course, if they emerge at all. Most won't. Most will just keep sailing through that nightmare until their Geller fields fail, or they run out of supplies, or something worse happens." He opened his eyes, looked at me. "I think it means that every world in the Imperium just became an island. No more reinforcements. No more supply ships. No more tithes being collected or distributed. Just islands. Some of them will survive. Most won't." "And Terra?" I asked, though I already knew. We both knew. "If the astronomican is out," Jeremiah said quietly, "then the throne has failed. And if the throne has failed, then the Emperor is truly dead. And if the Emperor is dead, then—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Then there's nothing holding back the rent in reality beneath the throne world, the webway breach that he's been sealing with his will for 10,000 years. It'll open. Terra will burn. Holy Terra, the throne world, the center of everything we've built and believed in for longer than most planets have been inhabited, will become a new Eye of Terror. And then—" He trailed off. "And then the warp spreads," I finished. "Without Terra as an anchor, without the Emperor's psychic presence maintaining even that thin shell of order, the warp just spreads. Other breaches open. The galaxy folds in on itself." I felt my own words as I spoke them, felt their weight, and it was like swallowing stones. "How long?" I asked. "How long do we have?" Jeremiah shrugged, a helpless gesture. "Hours? Days? The Segmentum commanders won't know what's happened immediately. Some of them will assume it's a local phenomenon, that the light will return. They'll wait for instructions that will never come. By the time they understand, by the time anyone understands." He looked at me, and his eyes were ancient. "We're psychers, Methodius. We know what happens when the barrier thins. We know what's waiting on the other side. Without the Emperor's light holding them back, without his will maintaining the division between the materium and the immaterium, those things will come through, everywhere, all at once. Every daemon, every warp entity, every nightmare that humanity has spent 10,000 years keeping at bay. The briefing from Station Command came exactly 30 minutes after Commissar Helbrecht's announcement, and it told us nothing we didn't already know. Magos Brennus, his voice even more mechanical than usual, confirmed the cessation of the astronomican, confirmed that all attempts to establish contact with Terra or any segmentum command had failed, confirmed that we were to maintain our stations and continue monitoring for any psychic transmissions in the local sector. Standard crisis protocols. As if there were protocols for the end of the Imperium, as if a relay station of 340 souls floating in the void between stars could do anything meaningful when the galaxy was tearing itself apart. But protocols were what we had, so protocols were what we followed. I returned to Chamber 17 and jacked back into the apparatus, though the experience was profoundly different now. Without the astronomican's carrier signal, the local psychic landscape felt like trying to read in a dark room, possible, but uncertain, every shadow potentially hiding something terrible. I could still sense nearby transmissions, but they were fragmented, directionless, lacking the ordered structure that the golden thread had imposed. I spent 6 hours sorting through what I could find. Panicked transmissions from Navy vessels suddenly unable to calculate safe warp routes. Distress calls from worlds realizing their supply shipments would never arrive. Prayers hurled into the void with no destination. The prayers were the worst. So many prayers. Billions of voices crying out to a God who was no longer there to hear them, if he had ever heard them at all. Between transmissions, in the gaps where I had always felt the astronomican's steady pulse, I began to feel something else. A pressure, a presence. Nothing distinct enough to identify, nothing close enough to be an immediate threat, but it was there nonetheless, pushing against the veil between realities with a force that was slowly, inexorably increasing. The barriers were thinning. Jeremiah had been right about that. How long until they broke entirely? How long until something came through? The first incident occurred 17 hours after the astronomican went out. I wasn't jacked in at the time. You could only maintain the psychic link for so long, before you needed to disconnect and let your brain rest, lest you burn out your synapses and become one of the drooling husks that occasionally had to be carried out of the relay chambers and delivered to the Medicae Bay for their final journey to servitor conversion. I was in the communal eating hall, forcing down a ration bar that tasted of textured protein and machine oil, when the screaming started. Not psychic screaming, physical screaming. Human vocal cords pushed to their limit. Everyone in the hall froze. We had lived with the psychic screams for so long that we had learned to function around them. But this was different. This was immediate. This was in our physical space. I dropped my ration bar and ran toward the sound, along with a dozen others, and we found the source in Chamber 23. Chorus Tender First Class. Isabella Marwitz was still in her receiver cradle, cables attached to her neural ports, her body convulsing so violently that blood was starting to leak from where the connections tore at her flesh. Her eyes were open, rolled back to show only whites, and her mouth was stretched in that scream, that endless scream. And even from the doorway I could feel it, the psychic pressure, the presence that had somehow focused itself through her, using her as a conduit. Magos Brennus arrived within seconds, his augmented legs carrying him faster than any unmodified human could move. And he immediately began the emergency disconnection sequence, his mechadendrites working the neural cables with precision born of thousands of such procedures. But it was too late. Even I could see that, and I wasn't a tech priest. Something had burned through Isabella's mind like acid through parchment. When they finally pulled her free of the apparatus, she was still breathing, but her eyes were empty. No recognition, no humanity. Just a biological shell that no longer contained anything that could be called Isabella Marwitz. Empyrean breach via psychic channel. Magos Brennus intoned, his voice utterly without inflection. The chorus. Tender's mental defenses were insufficient against the increased pressure differential between the materium and the immaterium. Cause of failure. Absence of astronomican shielding protocols. Prognosis. Additional failures likely if psychic monitoring continues at current parameters. He turned to face those of us who had gathered at the chamber entrance. All psychers will reduce connection depth by 40% and limit continuous interface time to 2-hour increments maximum. Non-compliance will result in outcomes similar to this one. I stared at what had been Isabella, her body now being strapped to a gurney by servitors for transport to the Medicae Bay, and I understood with perfect clarity that Magos Brennus was telling us we had a choice between doing our jobs and remaining human, that the very act of opening ourselves to the psychic realm, the act we had been trained and sanctioned and rebuilt to perform, had become actively suicidal now that the Emperor's light no longer provided even minimal protection. We could stop, refuse to jack in, preserve ourselves. But then the relay station would cease to function, and the last thread of communication in this sector of space would be severed, and we would simply be 340 souls waiting in the dark for whatever came next. I don't know what the others decided. I know what I decided. I returned to Chamber 17, sat in my cradle, and connected the neural cables with hands that barely shook at all. I reduced my connection depth as ordered, kept my presence in the psychic landscape shallow and contained, and I continued sorting the screaming. Because it was what I knew how to do, because the alternative was sitting in my tiny quarters staring at the wall and waiting for the end. Because even in the face of absolute cosmic horror, routine was a kind of defiance. I would do my job until I couldn't anymore. It was not much of a philosophy, but it was mine. The transmissions changed over the following days. At first, they were panic, confusion, fear, demands for information that no one could provide. Then they became reports of what was happening across the Imperium. Navy vessels emerging from the warp thousands of light-years off course, some appearing in systems that had been Xenos-held for centuries, others manifesting inside stars or too close to planetary gravity wells to correct their velocity. Guard regiments on campaigns suddenly cut off from supply and reinforcement, forced to either dig in and hope for relief that would never come, or attempt desperate breakouts that almost always ended in slaughter. Forge worlds realizing their raw material shipments had stopped, that the great manufactorums would fall silent within months. Hive worlds understanding that the food shipments from their agri-world suppliers were never going to arrive, that the populations of billions would begin to starve. It was a cascade, you see. Every failure creating more failures, the whole vast apparatus of the Imperium grinding itself apart like a machine stripped of lubricant, metal tearing against metal, until nothing remained but fragments. But those were the early reports, from worlds and fleets that still had enough order to compose coherent messages. After about a week, the tone shifted again. The messages became less structured, more desperate. Fragmented accounts of impossible things. Fleets reporting entire ships lost to possession, their crews turned into something else, something that wore human skin but was no longer human. Worlds describing phenomena that shouldn't exist in real space geometries that hurt to perceive, sounds that caused madness, colors that had no name. The veil was tearing, not everywhere at once, but in thousands of places simultaneously, each breach growing, spreading, connecting to others. I sorted these messages, catalogued them, forwarded them to Station Command, knowing that there was no higher authority to receive them, no segmentum headquarters that could coordinate a response, no Terra to provide guidance. The galaxy was drowning in nightmares, and we were documenting the process. The second incident at Tertius 9 happened on the 9th day. This time, it wasn't a psyker who broke. It was an administratum adept named Carolus, a thin man in his 50s, who had spent 3 decades processing the documentation of our psychic transmissions without complaint or notable distinction. He was found in his office, surrounded by papers covered in script that was not Low Gothic, not High Gothic, not any human language at all. The script moved. I was told by those who saw it before Commissar Helbreck had all the papers incinerated. It crawled across the pages like living things, and looking at it too long caused vertigo, nausea, a feeling that your eyes were turning inside out to see things that should remain forever invisible. Carolus himself was dead, his wrists opened by the same stylus he had used to write the script. Blood pooled across his desk in patterns that suggested intentionality. The patterns were also incinerated before I could see them. I was grateful for that mercy. Helbrecht convened an assembly in the primary chapel, the only space large enough to hold all 340 of us at once. He stood before the altar, beneath the towering aquila that dominated the far wall, his commissar's coat immaculate, his face carved from stone. "We are entering a period of testing," he said, his voice carrying through the vaulted space. "The enemy seeks to break our faith, to turn us from our duty through fear and despair. This is nothing new. This is the eternal war, the same struggle that has defined humanity since we first opened our eyes to the stars and saw what waited in the darkness." He paused, let his gaze sweep across the assembled crowd. "Some of you are questioning whether continued service has meaning in the absence of Terra's light. I am here to tell you that meaning is not contingent on external validation. We serve because we are servants. We fight because we are soldiers. We endure because to do otherwise is to surrender, and surrender is treason. The Emperor protects. He has always protected. If his light appears to have failed, it is not because he has abandoned us, but because we are being tested to see if we will abandon him." I listened to Helbrecht's words, and I wanted to believe them. I wanted to feel the certainty he projected, the absolute conviction that this was merely another trial in the long history of trials that defined the Imperial experience. But I was a psyker. I had spent 43 years with my consciousness opened to the immaterial, and I knew what I felt pressing against reality. The Emperor had not withdrawn his light to test us. The Emperor was gone, and what remained was the consequence of that absence, the raw, unfiltered hostility of the warp, no longer held at bay by a will so vast it had sustained an entire species for 10,000 years. Helbrecht's faith was not wrong exactly. It was simply insufficient. You could not believe your way through a hull breach. You could not pray away the vacuum. But I kept these thoughts to myself, because to voice them would be heresy, and heresy was a quick path to execution, and I was not ready to die. Not yet. I still had work to do. I returned to Chamber 17 after the assembly, and jacked in. Reduced depth, 2-hour maximum, sorting the screaming. By now I had begun to develop a taxonomy of the transmissions I received. There were the practical ones, distress calls, tactical reports, requests for assistance that would never be answered. There were the religious ones, prayers, confessions, pleas for divine intervention. And then there were the new ones, the messages that came from minds already touched by the warp, from psychers who had not been strong enough or disciplined enough to maintain their barriers when the astronomican fell. These were the worst. They weren't entirely human anymore, but they weren't entirely inhuman either. They existed in some terrible middle state, aware enough to understand what was happening to them but powerless to stop it. They screamed in frequencies that made my teeth ache. They whispered truths about the nature of reality that, if contemplated too deeply, would shatter sanity like glass. I logged them, catalogued them, and tried very hard not to listen to the actual content of what they said. On the 14th day, we lost contact with 3 more psychers simultaneously. Different chambers, different shifts, but all 3 of them experiencing the same catastrophic breach within a span of 10 minutes. The pattern suggested that whatever was pressing against the veil was growing stronger, more focused, learning how to exploit our vulnerabilities. Magos Brennus issued new protocols. Maximum connection depth reduced another 20%. Continuous interface time cut to 90 minutes. At these settings we could barely function. The psychic landscape became a blur of half-glimpsed impressions, messages reduced to emotional gestalt rather than coherent communication. But we continued, because the alternative was disconnection, and disconnection was failure, and failure was treason. I began to notice changes in myself around this time. Small things at first: difficulty sleeping, persistent headaches, a metallic taste that lingered no matter what I ate or drank. My reflection in the polished copper of Chamber 17's walls looked wrong somehow, though I couldn't articulate what precisely had changed. My eyes, maybe. Something about the pupils, the way they responded to light. Or perhaps the way my face had begun to seem unfamiliar, as if I were looking at a stranger wearing my features like a mask. I mentioned none of this in my monthly medical evaluation. The Medicaid servitors were only programmed to detect gross physiological dysfunction anyway, and whatever was happening to me was occurring at a level they weren't equipped to measure. The dreams started on the 19th day. Except they weren't dreams, not really, because I experienced them while I was awake. I would be sitting in my chamber, disconnected from the apparatus, resting between sessions, and suddenly I would be somewhere else. Not physically, my body remained in Chamber 17. I could still feel the deck plating beneath me, still smell the incense, but my consciousness would slip sideways into a space that was adjacent to reality. In this space, I could see things. The station around me was no longer metal and stone but something organic, walls that breathed, corridors that pulsed like arteries. The other personnel were hollow shapes, puppets of meat animated by something that watched through their eyes. And beyond the station, in the void that surrounded us, there were presences, vast and patient and utterly alien. They circled our little bubble of reality like sharks smelling blood in water. They were waiting for the barriers to thin just a little more, waiting for the moment when they could finally push through, and then I would snap back to normal perception, gasping, my hands shaking, and Chamber 17 would be solid and real again. But the memory of that other vision lingered, the knowledge that it wasn't imagination or hallucination, but a glimpse of truth, a perception of reality unfiltered by the comfortable lies that allow human consciousness to function. I was seeing too much, going too deep, despite the reduced connection parameters, despite all my training and discipline. The warp was no longer something I opened myself to, it was opening me, using my sanctioned abilities as a doorway into the materium. I was becoming a breach point, just like Isabella had been, just like the other psychers who had lost themselves. It was only a matter of time. On the 23rd day, Commissar Helbrecht shot his first psyker. Chorus tender second-class Marcus Trell, who worked Chamber 8, had begun speaking in tongues during a routine debriefing, his voice overlapping with itself in impossible harmonics, his words simultaneously low Gothic, and something that predated human language entirely. Helbrecht didn't hesitate. One bolt round, directly through the skull, Marcus's head detonating in a spray of bone and brain matter that painted the briefing room wall. Then Helbrecht turned to those of us who remained and said simply, "Vigilance." As if that explained everything. As if the summary execution of a colleague, a brother in service, was nothing more than routine maintenance. Perhaps it was. Perhaps that was all any of us had ever been, components in a machine, to be replaced or discarded when we ceased to function optimally. I thought about running. There was nowhere to run to. Of course the station was finite, every corridor known, every chamber monitored, but I thought about it nonetheless. I thought about disconnecting from the apparatus permanently, refusing to jack in, accepting whatever punishment came. Execution would be a mercy compared to what waited if I continued. But then I would return to Chamber 17, would sit in my cradle, would connect the neural cables, and I would sort the screaming. Because it was what I knew, because the routine was the only thing holding me together. Because if I stopped, I would have nothing but the dreams that were no longer dreams, the visions of a reality peeling away to reveal the nightmare beneath. The messages I processed had changed again. Now they came from worlds that had already fallen, not conquered by external enemies, invaded by internal collapse, by the warp erupting from within as the barriers finally failed. I heard testimony from survivors describing their neighbors transforming, flesh running like wax, bodies becoming gateways for things that had no business existing in three-dimensional space. I heard from guard commanders who had been forced to execute entire regiments rather than let them succumb to possession. I heard from planetary governors issuing final declarations before enacting exterminatus on their own worlds, choosing sterile death over demonic corruption. The Imperium was cannibalizing itself, each world becoming a tiny isolated kingdom with no hope of relief or rescue, forced to make impossible decisions with no guidance from any higher authority. And in all of this, in all the thousands of messages I processed, not a single transmission came from Terra. Nothing from the segmentum commands, nothing from the High Lords, nothing from any source that suggested a coordinated Imperial response. The center had not held. The center had, in fact, ceased to exist. What remained was fragments, each fragment pretending to still be part of a greater whole, maintaining the fiction of unity even as the reality of separation became undeniable. On the 31st day, I processed a message from a blind astropath on a shrine world in the Ultima Segmentum. The transmission was fragmentary, barely coherent, but what came through was this: Terra had fallen. Not in battle. There had been no battle. The Golden Throne had failed, the ancient mechanisms finally giving out after 10,000 years of continuous operation, and in that failure, the Emperor's physical form had been destroyed. Not his soul. The message was clear about that, or as clear as such things could be, but his material presence, the corpse body that had sat upon the throne, was gone, and with it, the psychic seal he had maintained over the webway breach beneath the Imperial palace had shattered. The warp had poured through, not slowly, not gradually, but in a cataclysmic eruption that had consumed the entire throne world in a matter of hours. Terra, Holy Terra, the cradle of humanity, the seat of the Imperium, was now a daemon world, a new eye of terror, burning at the very heart of human space. I sat in Chamber 17 after processing that message, cables still connected to my neural ports, and I laughed. It was not a sane sound. It was the laughter of a man who has carried an impossible weight for so long that when it is finally taken from him not through success but through absolute catastrophic failure, the absence feels like flight. Terra had fallen. The Emperor was dead. Truly dead this time. No longer maintained in that twilight state between life and death, but actually, definitively gone. Everything we had believed in, everything we had sacrificed for, every prayer and tithe and servitude, all of it had been in service to a lie. Not a malicious lie. I didn't think the Imperium had been deliberately deceiving us, but a lie nonetheless. The lie that any of this could last forever, that 10,000 years of entropy could be held at bay through faith and fury alone. I should have reported the message to Station Command. That was protocol. But instead I sat there, laughing, until the laughter turned to something else. Something that might have been crying, except I had forgotten how to cry decades ago. And then I disconnected from the apparatus, pulled the cables from my neural ports with shaking hands, and I walked out of Chamber 17. I walked through the corridors of Tertius 9, past servitors that continued their maintenance routines, as if nothing had changed, past administratum adepts hunched over their cogitators, documenting our collective doom with bureaucratic precision, past tech priests chanting their machine prayers to a god who was just as dead as the human one. I walked until I reached the station's primary observation deck, a small chamber with reinforced windows that looked out into the void. The view was magnificent. The gas giant we orbited was a swirl of orange and brown, storms larger than continents churning across its surface in patterns that had been repeating for millions of years before humanity ever left Terra, and would continue for millions more after we were gone. Beyond it, stars, so many stars, each one potentially hosting worlds with their own stories of struggle and failure and desperate survival. The galaxy was incomprehensibly vast. The Imperium, for all its presumptions of dominance, had occupied only a tiny fraction of that vastness, and now even that fraction was dissolving, each isolated world becoming its own universe. disconnected from all the others, alone in the dark. I stood at the observation window for a long time, watching the stars, and I thought about what came next. The station would continue to function as long as the tech priests could maintain the systems, as long as the plasma reactors kept running, as long as no external force destroyed us. We might have years, decades even. Enough time for everyone aboard to live out their natural lives in this bubble of maintained reality, sorting transmissions from a galaxy that was tearing itself apart, documenting the end with all the precision and dedication that the administratum had brought to every task for 10,000 years. And when the last of us died, the station would fall silent, just another piece of abandoned human detritus floating through the void, its purpose extinct, its inhabitants long since become dust. Or perhaps something would find us before then. Perhaps the things that circled in the warp, patient and hungry, would finally breach our reality. Perhaps the veil would tear completely, and we would have a more immediate end. I found I didn't much care which outcome occurred. Both seemed equally inevitable. Both were equally beyond my ability to influence. But then, I felt it, the pressure, the presence I had been sensing for weeks, growing stronger. And I understood that my time was running out, not the station's time, mine. The warp was done being patient with me. It had been pushing against my defenses, eroding them slowly, learning the shape of my mind and the weaknesses in my training. And soon, it would push through entirely. I would become like Isabella, like Marcus, like all the others who had opened themselves to the Imperium and found that it had opened them in return. My consciousness would dissolve, my identity would fragment, and what remained would be something else wearing my skin. A puppet, a gateway, a weapon turned against the very reality I had spent my life trying to protect. I could return to my quarters, I thought. Take the las pistol I kept in the locker beside my bunk. We were all issued sidearms, a final resort against possession, and end myself before the breach occurred. Clean, dignified. A choice, at least, in a universe that had revealed itself to be fundamentally hostile to human agency. But even as I considered it, I knew I wouldn't, because I was still, after everything, a servant of the Imperium. The Imperium was dead. Yes, the Emperor was dead. Terra was lost. But the habit of service remained. I would return to Chamber 17. I would jack in. I would sort the screaming until I couldn't anymore. It was what I knew how to do. It was who I was. I left the observation deck and walked back through the corridors, my footsteps echoing off metal walls. I passed Jeremiah in the hallway, and we stopped, looked at each other. He knew. I could see it in his eyes, the same knowledge I carried, the same understanding of what came next. "How long do you think we have?" he asked. "Not long," I said. He nodded. "Will you do it yourself? Or wait for Helbrecht?" I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but when he asked, the answer was obvious. "Neither," I said. "I'm going back to my chamber. I'm going to work until I can't." Jeremiah smiled, and it was almost peaceful. "That's what I thought you'd say. I'm doing the same." He reached out, gripped my shoulder briefly, the most physical contact we'd had in 2 decades of proximity. "It's been an honor, Methodius. And with you, Jeremiah." We parted then, each returning to our respective chambers, our respective cradles, our respective dooms. I sat down in Chamber 17, connected the neural cables to my ports, and opened myself to the psychic landscape once more. The pressure was immense now, a weight that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The veil was so thin I could see through it, could perceive the shapes that waited on the other side. They were vast, hungry, patient, and they knew I was there. They knew I was a doorway almost ready to open. I found a transmission in the chaos, a final message from a Navy captain whose ship was breaking apart in real space, its Geller field having failed during what should have been a routine warp jump. The captain's voice was steady as he described the crew transforming around him, as he detailed the geometry of the ship's interior changing from human design to something else entirely. He spoke directly to whoever might be listening, knowing that no rescue was possible, no salvation would come. "If any loyal servant of the Emperor receives this," he said, "know that we went down fighting. Know that we maintained our humanity to the last. Know that." And then the transmission cut off, not with static, but with something worse. A sound that was simultaneously laughter and screaming, and a music that predated language itself. I logged the transmission, catalogued it, filed it in the appropriate section of the cogitator's memory banks where it would sit forever, unread, irrelevant, another data point in the comprehensive documentation of a species' failure. And then I felt it the moment I had been dreading, the instant when the pressure became too much and something inside me broke. Not painfully, just a quiet snap, like a cable finally giving out under too much load. The veil tore, and things came through. I want to tell you what it felt like, but I lack the language. Human consciousness isn't built to comprehend existence outside of linear time and three-dimensional space. We can't process information that arrives backwards through causality, can't integrate perceptions that exist in dimensions we don't have names for. But I'll try. Imagine your entire identity, everything you think of as you, all your memories and beliefs and personality, suddenly revealed to be a tiny, fragile pattern that only exists because nothing has disturbed it yet. And then imagine something reaching in and stirring that pattern, dissolving its boundaries, mixing it with other patterns, other identities, until there's no clear distinction between what was you and what was them. You're still conscious, you're still aware, but you're aware of so much more than you were before, and that awareness is incompatible with remaining human. I felt my body convulse in the cradle, felt blood running from my ports where the neural cables tore at flesh that was already beginning to change. I felt my consciousness expanding, stretching, connecting to the things that had come through the breach, and they were not hostile, not cruel, they were simply other, operating according to logics that had no relation to human survival or sanity. They were curious about me, about the station, about the tiny bubble of maintained reality that we had constructed in this corner of the void. They wanted to understand it, and in understanding it, they would unmake it, because understanding requires interaction, and their very touch was antithetical to the laws that governed physical existence. Somewhere, distantly, I heard alarms, heard shouting, heard the heavy footsteps of Commissar Helbrick running toward Chamber 17, his bolt pistol already drawn. But it was too late, far too late. The breach had occurred. I was no longer Methodius Crane, Chorus Tender Third Class. I was a gateway, a wound in reality through which things that should not exist were pouring into the materium, and I couldn't close it. I didn't even want to anymore, because from this side of the veil I could finally see the truth. The Imperium had been dying for 10,000 years. The Emperor's sacrifice hadn't saved humanity. It had merely delayed the inevitable. We were always going to end like this, fragmenting into isolated worlds, drowning in the nightmares we had fought so hard to keep at bay. Terra's fall was not a tragedy. It was a conclusion. The door to Chamber 17 I-rised open. Helbrick entered, his bolt pistol raised, his face a mask of determination. He saw me in the cradle, saw the blood, saw the way my body was already beginning to change, flesh running like wax, bones restructuring themselves according to geometries that existed only in the war. He didn't hesitate. I respected that about him. One shot. Clean. Precise. The bolt round entered my skull and detonated, and for just an instant before my consciousness dissolved entirely, I felt something like gratitude. He had given me the mercy I couldn't give myself. He had ensured that what I became wouldn't have the chance to spread further, to turn the station into another breach point. But I can tell you this story, can't I? I can describe what happened, can record these events in words that you're reading now. So perhaps the bolt round didn't end me as completely as Helbrick intended. Perhaps some fragment of Methodius Crane persisted, encoded in the psychic scream that echoed through the relay station as I died. Perhaps that fragment lingered in the apparatus, in the copper walls of Chamber 17, in the very structure of the station itself. Perhaps consciousness, once touched by the warp, doesn't end so much as it transforms, becoming something that exists simultaneously in multiple states, dead and alive, human and daemon, individual and multitude. Or perhaps this is all just the final hallucination of a dying mind, neurons firing randomly as biological functions cease, creating the illusion of narrative where there is only noise. Perhaps I'm not telling you this story at all. Perhaps you're telling it to yourself, using my voice as a vehicle for your own contemplation of endings and transformations and the fragility of everything you believe to be permanent. In the end, it doesn't matter. The story is the same regardless of who speaks it. Terra fell. The Emperor died. The Imperium fragmented into 1 trillion isolated kingdoms, each one an island in a sea of daemons. And Relay Station Tertius 9 continued its eternal orbit around a gas giant, in a system no one will ever visit. Its staff reduced one by one as the warp claimed them, until finally the last servitor shut down from lack of maintenance, and the entire structure went dark and silent. Somewhere in that darkness, in Chamber 17, my body still sits in its cradle, preserved by the cold vacuum that filled the station when the atmospheric systems failed. A monument to service, a testament to futility, a warning that no one will ever read. This is what happens when Terra falls. Not a bang, not even a whimper, just silence, spreading outward through the galaxy like a wave, drowning everything in its path. And in that silence, in the spaces between the stars where light no longer reaches, things are born. Things that were never meant to exist, things that carry fragments of human consciousness like insects preserved in amber, aware but unable to act, watching as the galaxy transforms into something unrecognizable. I am one of those things now. Or I was. Or I will be. Tense loses meaning when causality becomes negotiable. But I remember being Methodius Crane. I remember 43 years of service, sorting the screaming, maintaining the fiction that any of it mattered. And in remembering, I honor that service, futile though it was. I honor all the servants of the Imperium, all the billions and trillions who lived and died believing they were part of something greater, something eternal. They weren't. We weren't. But we believed. And the belief was real even if its object was not. And that has to count for something. Or perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps meaning is just another human fiction, no more substantial than the Imperium itself, just another pattern we impose on chaos to avoid confronting the fundamental indifference of existence. But either way, the story is told. Terra fell. I fell. We all fell. And what remains is this: a voice in the darkness, speaking to no one, saying nothing that matters, continuing anyway because continuation is the only option left. The alternative is silence. And silence is surrender. And surrender is, well, you know what surrender is. The Emperor protects, we used to say. But the Emperor is dead. And there is no protection. And the galaxy belongs to the things that swim in the warp now. This is what happens when Terra falls. This is what happens when the light goes out. This is what happens when you sought the screaming for so long that you can no longer distinguish it from your own voice. I wanted you to understand that. I wanted someone, anyone, to know that we tried, that we served until we couldn't serve anymore, that in the face of absolute horror, we maintained our routines and our protocols and our tiny gestures of defiance. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But we did it anyway, and now I'm done. The story is told. The confession is complete. What you do with it, whether you believe it, whether you remember it, whether it changes anything about how you face your own inevitable ending, that's beyond my ability to influence. I'm just a voice in the darkness after all. Just a fragment of a man who used to sort the screaming. Just another casualty of a war that was lost before it even began. The Emperor protects. But the Emperor is dead. and we're all alone in the dark, sorting the screaming, waiting for the silence.